Snow whipped across the horse pens of prairie rose, each gust dragging ice crystals through the air, like shards of broken glass. The frontier town, huddled between open prairie and the frozen bend of the Powder River, a collection of raw timber buildings and canvas-roofed shacks that seemed to shrink under the weight of the January sky. Men crowded the auction rails, their boots crusted with ice and manure, their breath hanging in clouds as they shouted bids for half-starved broncs that stamped and shivered in the churned snow. The smell of horse sweat and unwashed bodies mixed with the sharp bite of wood smoke from nearby stoves, and the air tasted of iron and desperation. At the far end of the corral, tied to the same weathered post as a sway-backed bay gelding, stood a young woman. Her name was Juliana, though no one in the crowd had bothered to ask it. 19 years old, with dark hair plastered to her skull by melting snow, she wore only a thin white dress that clung to her shaking frame like a second skin. Her bare feet rested on packed snow that had turned pink where her skin had cracked and bled. A slate hung from her neck on a length of twine chalked with uneven letters, "Indenture contract, debt for sale." The auctioneer, a red-faced man named Poke, with a voice like gravel sliding down a tin roof, tapped his gavel against the rail and bellowed over the wind. "Next lot, one bay gelding, 12 hands, sound enough for light work and the contract on this here girl. Package deal, gentlemen. Debt and labor together, cheaper than a good mare." He grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "She can cook clean, and she don't talk back much. Ain't that right, sweetheart?" Laughter rolled through the crowd, ugly and casual. Someone threw a clod of frozen manure that struck the post near Juliana's shoulder, spattering her dress with brown streaks. She flinched, but did not cry out. Her eyes gray as the river ice stared past the men, as if she could will herself into some other place, some other life. The cold had long since stopped hurting. Now it was just a weight pressing down on her chest, making each breath a conscious effort. A figure moved at the edge of the gathering, drawing a few sidelong glances and one muttered curse. He was Lakota tall and lean, his face weathered by sun and wind into plains of shadow and light. 26 years old, he wore buckskin leggings, a heavy wool shirt beneath a tattered coat, and a war bonnet with eagle feathers that had seen better days. Fresh bruises darkened his forearm, remnants of a skirmish with bounty hunters 2 days prior near the Bighorn foothills. His pony, a sturdy paint with a scarred flank and intelligent eyes, stood quiet beneath him as he studied the scene with the stillness of a man accustomed to watching predators. His name was Hayamovi, which meant High Chief in his mother's tongue, though he bore no such title now. He carried the weight of responsibility like a stone in his chest. His father had been a respected warrior, killed 3 years ago in a skirmish with gold miners near the Black Hills. The duty of keeping the band fed and safe through the brutal winters had fallen to Hayamovi, and he bore it without complaint. He had ridden into Prairie Rose under the fragile truce that allowed winter trading carrying buffalo hides to exchange for flour and ammunition before the passes closed entirely. He had not come to fight. He had come to survive the season. But survival, he was learning, had a way of dragging a man into fights he never asked for. The bidding started. A rancher in a beaver skin hat offered $10. A saloon keeper with gold teeth raised it to $12. Polk grinned and gestured toward Juliana with his gavel. "Don't forget the girl, boys. Strong back, young enough to learn, and she's got all her teeth." He reached out and lifted Juliana's chin with a gloved hand, forcing her mouth open like she was livestock. "See good breeding stock if you're inclined." The crowd roared with laughter. Coins jingled, and someone passed a whiskey bottle that sloshed amber liquid. A miner threw a handful of snow that struck her square in the chest, and she gasped as the cold hit her bare skin. The sound was small, almost inaudible, but it carried to Hayamovi like a scream. His jaw tightened, His knuckles whitened on the reins, and his pony shifted beneath him, sensing the tension. He had seen this before. 2 years ago, his younger sister Winona had nearly vanished into a contract like this one arranged by Army scouts, who promised respectable work and delivered something else entirely. He had ridden to Fort Laramie and found her 3 months later, half-starved and hollow-eyed, traded among soldiers like whiskey. He had brought her home, but the light had gone out of her eyes. She barely spoke now, and when she did, her voice was flat empty. That haunted look still rode with Hayamovi, a ghost he could never outrun. Now roped to a post in the snow, another woman was being sold like livestock. And every man in Prairie Rose seemed to think it was funny. Juliana's composure, held so tightly for so long, finally cracked. She dragged in a breath of freezing air that burned her throat and turned her head toward the crowd. Her voice, hoarse and desperate, cut through the wind and the laughter. "Don't buy the horse," she cried. "Buy me, please. I'll be yours forever." The crowd exploded. Men slapped their knees, boots stomped in the snow, and the whiskey bottles shattered against the fence. One cowhand doubled over, laughing so hard he could barely breathe. Another threw a clod of ice that struck her shoulder, and she staggered against the post. Polk laughed so hard he nearly dropped his gavel. Hayamovi edged his pony closer to the fence. He had hides worth $30, maybe $40 if the trader was generous. It was supposed to feed his family through the coldest months. It was not enough to buy a human life, and he knew it. But the sight of Juliana, shivering and desperate, slammed into the old wound his sister had left behind. He could not look away. He swung down from the saddle, his boots sinking into the snow with a soft crunch. Snowflakes clung to the feathers of his bonnet, melting slowly. Juliana's eyes met his for the first time, and he saw in them the same terrible calculation he had seen in Winona's face, weighing one master against another, measuring the depth of the cage. "I will not buy you," he said quietly. His voice was low, but it carried. Her face twisted. Hope died as quickly as it had flared, replaced by something harder. Resignation. "Then leave," she whispered. "You are no different from the rest." Hayamovi did not leave. Instead, he turned his gaze to the man standing beside the auctioneer. Barnaby Lowell, called Feather Frank, by those who did not fear him, watched the proceedings with the calm satisfaction of a man who owned the game. He wore a long coat of good wool polished boots and an ostrich plume tucked into his hat that bobbed with each movement. His face was smooth, well-fed, the face of a man who had never missed a meal or worried about winter. He held a folded contract in one hand, tapping it against his thigh like a conductor's baton. "Cut the rope," Hayamovi said. Barnaby smiled, showing even white teeth. "Can't do that, friend. Paper says I own the work she owes, and law says I can sell it." He tapped the contract against his belt. "You got law where you come from." "Different law," Hayamovi replied. And with one quick motion, he vaulted the rail. His hand went to the knife at his belt, a weapon he had carried since boyhood, the blade worn but sharp. He slashed the rope binding Juliana's wrists in a single stroke, the fibers parting with a snap. The crowd erupted. Men surged toward the corral, some furious, some simply eager for violence. Hayamovi threw his heavy buffalo robe around Juliana's shoulders and pulled her behind him as fists and boots closed in. A punch caught him in the ribs, doubling him over. Another struck his shoulder, pain exploding down his arm. He heard Juliana cry out as someone grabbed her hair, yanking her backward. A shot cracked through the air, sharp as a whip. Everyone froze. Sheriff René Duval stood on the boardwalk, revolver, raised his face red with cold and anger. Smoke curled from the barrel, and the smell of gunpowder mixed with the wood smoke and horse sweat. "Everybody stand back," he shouted. His voice was hard practiced. "I said back." The crowd obeyed, but slowly, reluctantly. Men muttered and glared, but they gave ground. Duval holstered his weapon and stepped down into the street, his boots crunching in the snow. He was 42 years old, a tall man, lean and hawk-like, with hands that moved faster than most men could follow. He had earned the nickname Quick Hand during his years as a cavalry officer, and he wore it like a badge of honor. But now his eyes slid to Barnaby, and Barnaby gave the smallest shake of his head. The message was clear. Duval pointed at Hayamovi. "You just tampered with a legal contract and disturbed the peace. You're under arrest. Both of you." Deputies closed in. Rough hands seized Hayamovi's arms and dragged him backward through the snow. Another man grabbed Juliana, ripping the buffalo robe from her shoulders and throwing it into the mud. She stumbled, and a boot caught her ankle, sending her sprawling. Hayamovi lunged toward her, but a fist caught him in the jaw, snapping his head back. Blood filled his mouth, hot and coppery. They were hauled through the frozen streets of Prairie Rose as the crowd jeered and followed, throwing snowballs and worse. By the time they reached the jail, Hayamovi's lip was split, and Juliana's hands were bleeding where the rope had torn her skin. The cell door slammed shut with the finality of a coffin lid, the iron ringing in the cold air. Prairie Rose lived off cattle freight wagons and the gray zone between law and profit. It was not a place where justice thrived, but it was a place where men with the right connections could grow rich. The town's main street was a muddy scar between rows of false-fronted buildings, a general store, a saloon with a faded sign reading, "Lucky Strike," a livery stable that smelled of manure and hay, a hotel with cracked windows, and a handful of other establishments that catered to ranchers, miners, and the occasional freight hauler passing through. Sheriff René Duval was one of the men who made Prairie Rose work. He filed enough reports to keep the territorial governor satisfied, arrested enough drunks and horse thieves to maintain the appearance of order, and closed his eyes to the things that kept merchants paying taxes. It was a careful balance, and he walked it with the skill of a man who had spent years navigating dangerous ground. The worst of those things was Barnaby Lowell. Barnaby ran the horse auctions, a freight business that connected Prairie Rose to Omaha and points east, and a side trade that no one in town spoke about openly, but everyone knew. He bought and sold indenture contracts papers that bound immigrant women to work until their passage debts were paid. The law said they would serve as housekeepers or cooks. The truth was far uglier. Barnaby's contracts were traded like livestock, and the women who signed them often disappeared into remote ranches or mining camps where no one asked questions. Sheriff Duval knew all of this. He closed his eyes to it because Barnaby held something over him, something that would destroy the careful reputation Duval had built. Years earlier, during a border skirmish with Lakota warriors near the Bighorn River, Duval's younger brother Thomas had been killed. The official report blamed a Lakota rifle. The truth, known only to Duval and a young private named Tobias Crane, was that the fatal bullet had come from Duval's own revolver, fired in panic when the lines broke and the enemy seemed to be everywhere at once. Tobias had helped him falsify the report, changing the angle of the wound, moving the body, creating a story that made Thomas a hero and absolved Duval of blame. Barnaby, through means Duval never fully understood, had acquired the original draft that showed the lie. Now, whenever Duval hesitated to look the other way, Barnaby would tap the breast pocket of his coat and smile. The message was always the same: do as you are told, or the truth goes east to the territorial governor and your career ends in disgrace. So Duval did as he was told. He filed reports that made Prairie Rose look orderly and safe. He arrested drunks and horse thieves. And he made sure no one interfered with Barnaby's business. Not everyone in town was blind to what was happening. Dr. Simon Keller, a war-scarred physician with a limp from Gettysburg, and a habit of drinking too much whiskey on cold nights patched up cowhands and miners in a small clinic near the edge of town. 41 years old, with gray threading through his hair and deep lines around his eyes, he had seen enough death during the war to last a lifetime. He had come west, hoping to leave the ghosts behind, but they had followed him. He had treated the women Barnaby brought through, had stitched their wounds, and heard their whispered pleas for help. But crossing Barnaby meant losing patients, losing the building he rented, and possibly losing his life. So Simon kept his head down and did what good he could within the narrow space Barnaby allowed him. The schoolteacher, Madeline Hart, was younger and angrier. 31 years old, a widow from Pennsylvania, she had come west to escape the memories of a husband who died at Antietam and a family that pitied her more than they loved her. She taught immigrant children their letters in a small schoolhouse that doubled as a church on Sundays, and she tried to give them some small hope that life in Prairie Rose might be better than the places they had fled. She knew what Barnaby was doing. She had seen the ledgers once by accident when she delivered a book to his office. The entries were written in a careful hand, listing names, debts, and destinations. Some of the names belonged to girls she had taught. None of those girls had ever come back to class. Madeline and Simon shared their quiet outrage over coffee in the clinic's back room, but neither knew how to fight a man who owned the sheriff and half the town council. They were good people in a bad place, and the weight of their helplessness pressed down on them like the winter sky. Juliana's story had followed the same grim pattern as dozens before her. She had arrived in New Orleans from a German-speaking village in Bohemia, carrying nothing but a canvas bag and a letter from a supposed cousin named Gregor, who promised work in St. Louis. The letter had been written in German, full of warm words and promises of a better life. The cousin had turned out to be a fiction, the job a lie, and the contract she signed with an X and a thumbprint had transferred her debt to Barnaby's control. She had spent 3 months working in a boarding house in Omaha, scrubbing floors and washing linens 16 hours a day, before Barnaby decided her contract was worth more in Prairie Rose. She had been loaded onto a freight wagon like a sack of grain and hauled west through the snow, sleeping under canvas and eating stale bread. Now she sat in a cell with a split lip and bleeding wrists, wondering if death might be kinder than whatever came next. The jail was a stone room with iron bars, barely warmer than the street outside. A crooked stove leaked more smoke than heat, and the only light came from a single lantern hanging on a nail. The floor was dirt-packed hard by years of boots and stained dark in places Juliana did not want to think about. She huddled in one corner, Hayamovi in the other. Neither spoke for a long time. The silence was broken only by the wind howling outside and the occasional crackle of the stove. Finally, Juliana broke the silence. "Why did you do that?" she asked. Her voice was raw, as if she had been screaming, though she had not. Hayamovi did not look at her. He sat with his back against the stone wall, his chained hands resting on his knees. Blood had dried on his lip, and his left eye was beginning to swell. "I have seen this before," he said. "And you think cutting a rope will change anything," she said bitterly. "They will hang you, and I will be back at that post tomorrow." "Maybe," Hayamovi said, "but not today." Juliana studied him in the dim light. His face was hard, unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that she recognized. Pain, loss, the kind of wound that never quite healed. "Who did you see?" she asked quietly. Hayamovi was silent for so long that she thought he would not answer. Then he spoke, his voice low. "My sister, Winona. Army scouts told her they needed a cook for Fort Laramie. They said she would be paid Fed safe. She was 15. Juliana's breath caught. "What happened?" "They lied," Hayamovi said. "She was not a cook. She was used, traded among the soldiers like whiskey. I found out 3 months later. I rode to the fort and brought her home, but it was too late." She does not speak anymore. She just stares. Juliana's eyes filled with tears. She wiped them away angrily. "I am sorry," she said. "I am sorry too," Hayamovi said. "For you." They sat in silence, after that the weight of their shared history settling between them like a third presence in the cell. Outside, the wind howled, and the temperature dropped further. In the saloon across the street, Barnaby Lowell bought drinks for angry ranch hands and turned the story of the day's disruption into a threat. Today, he cuts a contract. Barnaby said, his voice carrying over the clink of glasses and the scrape of chairs. Tomorrow his people ride through your fences and burn your barns. You want that kind of trouble? A length of rope appeared on the bar, coiled and waiting. Someone muttered about justice. Someone else said the word lynching like it was a prayer. The rope grew heavier with intent as the night wore on, and the whiskey flowed. Dr. Simon Keller arrived at the jail just after dark, carrying his medical bag and a flask of whiskey he used to clean wounds. His limp was more pronounced in the cold, and he favored his left leg as he climbed the steps. Sheriff Duval let him in without comment. The sheriff had no interest in the prisoners dying of infection before he could arrange something more convenient. Simon knelt beside Juliana, first, his movements practiced and efficient. He cleaned the rope burns on her wrists with carbolic acid, the sting making her gasp and pull away. "Hold still," he said gently. "If these get infected, you could lose your hands." She nodded, biting her lip as he worked. The acid burned like fire, but she did not cry out. When he was done, he wrapped her wrists in clean linen and tied the bandages with careful knots. Then he turned to Hayamovi, whose split lip had swollen and whose left eye was beginning to bruise. "Hold still," Simon said, threading a needle with practiced ease. Hayamovi did not flinch as the doctor stitched the tear in his lip, each pull of the thread sharp and precise. When it was done, Simon leaned in close and spoke under his breath. "The town is turning," he said. "Barnaby is buying drinks and telling stories. If he pushes the right men hard enough, they will not wait for a judge." Hayamovi met the doctor's eyes. "Then why are you here?" Simon hesitated. His hand still holding the needle trembled slightly. "Because I have seen too many people die for no good reason," he said finally. "And I am tired of it." He left before Duval could ask questions, his limp more pronounced as he climbed the steps back to the street. The door closed behind him with a hollow thud. That night, as the wind strengthened and snow piled against the jail's outer walls, Hayamovi and Juliana huddled near the failing stove. The temperature inside the cell had dropped so low that their breath frosted in the air, and the stone walls seemed to radiate cold like they were made of ice. Juliana's teeth chattered uncontrollably, and Hayamovi noticed the unnatural paleness spreading across her toes. He had seen frostbite before. He knew how quickly it could take hold. "Give me your foot," he said. She recoiled, pulling her legs closer to her body. "What?" "Frost takes it you will not walk again," he said bluntly. "No one decides for you after that?" She stared at him, fear and uncertainty warring in her eyes. Then slowly she extended her leg. Hayamovi took her foot in his hands, his palms rough and warm, and pressed it against his bare forearm. He rubbed the skin in firm, deliberate strokes, ignoring the cold that bit into his own flesh. It was not gentle. It was survival stripped of any pretense. Tears spilled down Juliana's cheeks, not from romance, but from the shock of being handled with care instead of ownership. For the first time since she had stepped off the ship in New Orleans, someone was touching her to preserve her, not to use her. The simple act of kindness, offered without expectation, broke something inside her that she had been holding together by sheer will. "Why do you care?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Hayamovi did not answer immediately. He kept rubbing until color returned to her toes, then released her foot and turned away, giving her privacy. "My sister," he said finally. "They sold her like this. I stopped it, but not soon enough." Juliana pulled her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around them. "What happened to her?" "She lived," Hayamovi said. "But she does not laugh anymore. She does not sing. She just exists." Juliana's voice was barely a whisper. "I am afraid I will become like her." "You will not," Hayamovi said, and there was a fierceness in his voice that surprised them both. "I will not let that happen." She looked at him, and for the first time since the auction, she felt something other than despair. It was not hope, not yet. But it was the faint possibility that hope might exist somewhere if she could survive long enough to find it. As the night deepened and the wind howled, Juliana spoke again, her voice soft. "What is your sister's name in your language?" "Winona," he said. "Winona." She repeated the syllables, careful on her tongue. "What does it mean?" "Firstborn daughter," he said. Juliana was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "In my language, my name means youthful, jugendlich, but I do not feel youthful anymore." Hayamovi looked at her. "What do you feel?" "Old," she said, "and angry." "Anger is good," he said. "Anger keeps you alive." She taught him a few German words that night, simple things: bread, water, cold, fire. He listened carefully, repeating each one until he had it right. It was a small exchange, but it built a bridge between them, a shared language of survival. Outside in the saloon, the rope on the bar grew heavier with intent. By morning, the storm had not broken. Snow fell in thick, wet flakes that turned the streets of Prairie Rose into rivers of slush. Sheriff Duval arrived at the jail with 2 deputies, and Tobias Crane, the young man, who had helped him lie about his brother's death. Tobias was 24 years old with a thin face and nervous hands that never seemed to stop moving. He had the look of a man carrying a weight he could not put down. "We're transferring you to the county seat," Duval announced, unlocking the cell door. The hinges screamed in protest. "Both of you, you'll stand trial there." Hayamovi knew a lie when he heard one. The county seat was 2 days' ride through open country, and with a storm like this, no one would see what happened along the way. He looked at Juliana, whose eyes had gone wide with understanding, and then back at Duval. "You will kill us on the road," Hayamovi said flatly. Duval smiled cold and thin. "That depends on whether you try to escape." Hayamovi was chained hand and foot, the iron biting into his wrists and ankles. The metal was cold enough to burn. Juliana was bound with a rope around her waist, the other end tied to the back of a horse. She had been given no coat, no shoes. The wet dress clung to her like a second skin, and her lips were already turning blue. They were loaded into a wagon with a canvas cover that did nothing to keep out the wind. Barnaby Lowell and his enforcer, a half-breed tracker named Cheyenne Charlie, rode alongside. Charlie was a quiet man with flat, dead eyes and a rifle that never left his hands. 2 deputies followed on horseback, and their rifles resting across their saddles, barrels pointed down but ready. As the caravan left Prairie Rose, Madeleine Hart stepped onto the boardwalk of the schoolhouse, clutching a folded piece of paper. She had spent the night searching through Juliana's few belongings, which had been confiscated and stored in the sheriff's office. Among them, she had found a letter written in German, supposedly from the cousin who had arranged Juliana's passage. Madeleine spoke enough German to read it, and the handwriting had struck her as familiar. She had seen it before, months ago, when she delivered a book to Barnaby's office and glimpsed the ledger on his desk. The letter and the ledger entries were written by the same hand. If she could place them side by side, the fraud would be undeniable. She caught Juliana's eye for half a second as the wagon rolled past. It was enough to promise someone is fighting for you. The caravan moved north into the teeth of the storm. The wind howled, driving snow into their faces until visibility dropped to a few yards. The horses struggled through drifts that rose to their chests, and the wagon wheels groaned under the strain. Inside the wagon, Juliana shivered uncontrollably. Hayamovi, chained beside her, shifted so that his body blocked some of the wind. It was a small thing, but it was all he could offer. Several miles from town, Duval called a halt at an old line shack, a low cabin used by cowhands during roundups. It was barely more than 4 walls and a leaking roof, but it was shelter. The party crowded inside, shaking off snow and cursing the cold. A fire was built in the stone hearth, and the horses were tied outside, their breath steaming in the frigid air. The inside of the cabin smelled of old smoke mildew and animal droppings. The floor was dirt littered with straw and broken bottles. Juliana's rope was tied to a roof beam. Hayamovi's chain was locked around a support post. They sat on opposite sides of the room, watching as Barnaby Duval and the others huddled around the fire. Barnaby pulled out a silver flask and passed it around. The firelight caught on his ostrich plume, making it bob like a living thing. "This is taking too long," he muttered. "We should finish it here." Duval shook his head. "Not yet. We need to be far enough out that no one questions the story." "What story?" Tobias Crane asked. His voice was tight, nervous. He had not spoken much during the ride, and now his hands shook as he accepted the flask. He took a long drink, coughed, and passed it back. Barnaby gave him a hard look. "The story where the Indian tried to run, shot one of us, and got himself killed. And the girl, she ran into the storm and froze. Tragic, really." Tobias's face went pale. "That is murder. That is cleanup," Barnaby said coldly. "And you are part of it, boy. You think you can walk away from this?" Duval shifted uncomfortably. He did not look at Hayamovi or Juliana. His hand rested on the butt of his revolver, and his jaw worked as if he were chewing something bitter. "We wait for the storm to ease," he said. "Then we move." But Tobias could not let it go. The guilt that had been eating at him for years finally boiled over. He had been 19 when he helped Duval lie about Thomas's death. He had thought it was the right thing to do, protecting a fellow soldier. But the lie had grown, become a thing with teeth, and now it was swallowing everything. "You going to kill another man to bury your own bullet?" he blurted. The room went silent. Duval's head snapped up, his face darkening. "Shut your mouth, Tobias." But Tobias was past caring. The whiskey had loosened his tongue, and the words poured out like water from a broken dam. "He knows," he said, pointing at Barnaby. "He knows you killed your own brother. He has the report, and he has been using it to make you do things like this." Juliana, tied to the roof beam, listened as the truth spilled out. The story of a panicked shot during a skirmish, a false report, years of blackmail. The sheriff's hatred of the Lakota was not born from justice. It was born from shame and fear and the desperate need to keep a lie alive. Duval lunged at Tobias, but Barnaby stepped between them. "Settle down," he said, his voice sharp. "We all have blood on our hands. The question is whether we walk out of here clean or dirty." While the men argued, Juliana studied the room. Duval's belt hung a ring of keys, but she could not reach them. Then she noticed something else, a broken belt buckle, old and bent, lying near the stove, where Duval had used it to stir the coals. It was small, but it was metal. And metal could pick a lock. She glanced at Hayamovi. His eyes were already on her, dark and steady. She jerked her chin toward the buckle, then toward the barrel of melted snow near the door. He gave the smallest nod. Juliana waited until the argument grew loud enough to cover the sound of her movement. She dragged herself toward the barrel, the rope cutting into her waist and making it hard to breathe. She dipped the hem of her dress into the water, soaking it, then inched toward the stove. The buckle was still warm from the fire, but not too hot to handle with the wet cloth. She wrapped it carefully, her fingers clumsy with cold, and kicked it across the floor toward Hayamovi. He trapped it with his boot, then bent down as if adjusting his chain. No one looked his way. The argument was reaching its peak. Voices raised hands, gesturing. While Hayamovi worked on his chains, Juliana turned her attention to her own bonds. The rope around her waist was thick, but the knot was simple, tied by men who assumed she was too weak or too frightened to try anything. She twisted her body, using her teeth to loosen the first loop. The hemp tasted of dirt and blood, and it tore at her lips, but she kept working. Slowly, painfully, the knot began to give. Hayamovi worked the buckle into the lock on his shackle, probing carefully. The metal was crude, but it was enough. He felt the mechanism give just slightly and pressed harder. The lock clicked open with a sound so soft it was lost beneath the argument. He left the shackle in place, waiting for the right moment. His heart pounded in his chest, and he forced himself to breathe slowly, evenly. Back in Prairie Rose, the storm showed no sign of breaking. Madeline Hart and Dr. Simon Keller sat in the clinic's back room, the letter and the ledger spread on the table between them. The ledger was heavy-bound in dark leather, filled with neat columns of names, dates, and destinations. Some of the names Madeline recognized. Some she did not. But the handwriting was unmistakable. Simon had sent word to a few trusted people. Niels, a Swedish farmer, whose sister had disappeared after signing one of Barnaby's contracts. An older widow named Agnes, whose son had died outside Barnaby's stables under suspicious circumstances. 2 younger cowhands named Pete and Jacob, who were sick of watching girls led away in wagons. "If we ride out now," Simon said, "we might catch them before they reach the county line." "If we ride out now," Madeline countered, "we might freeze to death before we find them." "Then we freeze," Simon said. His voice was flat, final. "Because if we do nothing, those 2 are dead." Madeline looked at the letter, at the careful script that matched Barnaby's ledger. Then she noticed something else, something she had missed before. At the back of the ledger, tucked between pages, were entries written in a different hand. Names that were not European. Lakota names written phonetically with notes about trade and exchange, and destinations in mining camps and army posts. One entry stood out: Winona, age 15, Fort Laramie, exchanged for supplies and land deed revision. "Simon," she said quietly, "look at this." Simon leaned over her shoulder and read. His face darkened. He was selling Lakota women too, and trading them for land deals. Madeline nodded. "If Hayamovi sees this, it will change everything." They gathered what they could: horses, lanterns, rifles, blankets, hardtack, and whiskey for warmth. Niels brought his 2 sons, both strong young men who knew how to track. Agnes insisted on coming despite her age, saying she had lived through worse storms and worse men. Pete and Jacob loaded their saddlebags with ammunition and extra rope. At dawn, they rode north into the blizzard. The wind tore at their clothes and stung their faces. The horses stumbled through drifts that rose higher with each mile. Twice, Niels's younger son nearly slid into the frozen river. They pressed on, guided by little more than stubbornness and the faint tracks the wagon had left before the snow covered them. Meanwhile, in the line shack, time was running out. The argument among Duval, Barnaby, and Tobias had grown uglier. Cheyenne Charlie, silent until now, stood and stretched. His joints cracked in the cold. "I am done waiting," he said. He drew his revolver, the metal gleaming in the firelight, and pointed it at Hayamovi. "Let us finish this." Duval started to protest, but Barnaby nodded. Do it. Hayamovi moved. He threw off the open chain and lunged not at Charlie, but at Barnaby, slamming into him and driving him into the table. The impact knocked the wind from Barnaby's lungs, and his revolver spilled from its holster, skidding across the floor. Charlie swung his rifle like a club, the butt catching Hayamovi in the shoulder. Pain exploded down his arm, leaving it weak and useless. But he had created chaos, and chaos was what they needed. Juliana threw her weight against the roof beam, yanking the loosened rope. The nail holding it creaked, then popped free with a sound like a gunshot. The beam dropped, and the rope slackened. She dove for the leather ledger that had fallen from Barnaby's coat during the struggle, clutching it to her chest. It was heavy, solid proof. A shot rang out. The lantern hanging from the ceiling shattered, and flaming oil splashed across the straw-covered floor. Fire leapt up the walls with terrifying speed, hungry and alive. The smell of burning wood and straw filled the cabin, acrid and choking. Duval, coughing and choking on smoke, staggered toward the door. Instinct took over, save himself worry about the story later. One of the deputies tripped over a chair and fell, his rifle clattering away. The cabin was filling with smoke, thick and black, and the heat was already unbearable. Hayamovi grabbed Juliana's wrist with his good hand. "Go!" he shouted. They burst through the side door into the blinding storm. Behind them, flames consumed the line shack, the roof collapsing in a shower of sparks that hissed and died in the snow. The heat was intense, pushing them forward, even as the cold bit at their exposed skin. Shots followed them into the snow, muffled by the wind. One bullet grazed Hayamovi's thigh, a hot slash of pain that nearly brought him down. He stumbled, caught himself, and kept moving, dragging Juliana toward the frozen river. Blood soaked his leggings, hot at first, then cold as it began to freeze. Another shot cracked closer this time. Hayamovi felt the impact in his side, a punch that stole his breath. He went down hard, pulling Juliana with him. The snow cushioned their fall, but the world tilted and his vision blurred at the edges. "Get up," Juliana said, her voice sharp with fear. "Hayamovi, get up." He tried. He planted his hands in the snow and pushed, but his arms would not hold him. Blood spread across the snow in a dark stain, steaming in the cold air. Juliana looked back. The men were coming, dark shapes in the white storm. She made a decision. She tore a strip from her dress and pressed it against the wound in Hayamovi's side, tying it as tight as she could. He gasped, pain lancing through him, but the pressure slowed the bleeding. "We move now, or we die here," she said. She pulled him to his feet, half dragging, half carrying him. He was heavier than she expected, all muscle and bone, but fear gave her strength. They stumbled toward the river, each step an agony. The riverbank was a maze of ice and shadow. The storm had turned the world into a white void where up and down lost all meaning. Hayamovi and Juliana plunged through drifts that rose to their waists, their breath coming in ragged gasps that tore at their throats. Behind them, the voices of their pursuers rose and fell distorted by the wind. Hayamovi angled along the bank, not toward open prairie, but toward a place where the river narrowed and the ice was thickest. He had hunted here before 2 winters passed. He knew the ice would hold if they were careful, but the horses would not know that. A deputy on horseback charged after them, his mount plunging through the snow. The horse was panicked, its eyes rolling white, and it did not see the danger. It stepped onto the ice, and the surface cracked like a gunshot. The ice gave way, and horse and rider plunged into the black water below. The deputy's scream cut off as the current dragged him under the weight of his coat and boots, pulling him down. The horse thrashed once, twice, then disappeared beneath the ice. The others pulled back, unwilling to risk the same fate. The blizzard, enemy to all, had become the fugitive's brief ally. But the cold was a different kind of predator. Hayamovi's wounded thigh and side throbbed, the pain sharp and constant. He was losing blood too fast, and he knew it. His vision kept tunneling darkness, creeping in at the edges. Juliana's dress was soaked through her lips, blue, her movements growing sluggish. They could not stay in the open much longer. "There," Hayamovi said, pointing to a dark shape barely visible through the snow. It was an overhang of rock, a shallow cave where the riverbank had eroded. It was not much, but it was something. They crawled inside, collapsing against the stone. The cave was barely deep enough to shelter them from the wind, but it was better than nothing. Juliana was shaking so hard her teeth clacked together. Hayamovi pulled her close, not for warmth, but to keep her conscious. His own body was growing cold, the heat bleeding out of him with every heartbeat. "Stay awake," he said. "If you sleep, you die." She nodded, though her eyes were already drifting shut. Then she looked at him, saw the blood soaking his side, and her eyes went wide. "You are bleeding," she said. "I know," he said. "We have to stop it," she said. She tore more strips from her dress, packing them against the wound. The fabric turned red almost immediately, but she kept pressing, kept working. Hayamovi taught her how to tie a pressure bandage, how to use a stick to twist the cloth tighter. She listened, memorizing every movement, her hands steady despite the cold. "Why do you care?" she whispered. "You do not know me." Hayamovi looked at her, at the bruises on her face and the rope burns on her wrists, at the way she clutched Barnaby's ledger like it was the only thing keeping her alive. And he realized that he did know her. He knew what it was like to be hunted, to be treated as less than human, to have your life weighed and found wanting by men who believed they had the right to decide your worth. "Because no one else will," he said. Juliana stared at him for a long moment, and then something shifted in her expression. The desperation was still there, but beneath it was a flicker of something harder. Determination. Anger. The will to survive, not just for survival's sake, but to make the bastards pay. "Then we survive," she said, "and we make them pay." Hayamovi nodded. "We survive," he agreed, "and we make them pay." Outside, the storm began to ease. The wind dropped, and the snow fell in slow, heavy flakes instead of blinding sheets. Visibility improved. That was both a blessing and a curse, because now Prairie Rose's vigilante party was on the move. Duval and Barnaby had returned to town, clothes singed, fury driving them forward. They stormed into the saloon and told their twisted story. The Lakota warrior had turned on them, set the shack ablaze, kidnapped the girl. Fear and anger churned through the crowd, fueled by whiskey and prejudice. The old gallows rope was dragged out into the snowy square. Men gathered, torches lit, voices rising in a chant for justice. It was a mob now, fueled by the same logic that had built every lynching tree west of the Mississippi. Fear of the other, fear of change, fear of being held accountable for their own sins. But Madeline Simon and their small band of rescuers were closer than Duval knew. They had found the burned-out line shack, the timbers still smoking, and the tracks leading toward the river. They pulled the half-drowned deputy from the ice, barely alive, and learned fragments of the truth. And now they were racing back to Prairie Rose, carrying proof that the sheriff and Barnaby had lied. Hayamovi and Juliana, too cold and too injured to stay hidden, made a desperate decision. They would not run. They would go back to Prairie Rose and face the mob, because the only way to survive was to expose the lie before it buried them. They staggered toward the town as the storm finally broke the sky, clearing to reveal a pale, merciless sun. The journey back to Prairie Rose nearly killed them. Every step was agony. Hayamovi's wounded thigh and side had stiffened, and he limped heavily, leaning on Juliana for support. She was stronger than she looked, fueled by anger and the stubborn refusal to die. But her feet were so numb she could barely feel them, and the wet dress had frozen into a stiff, icy shell that chafed her skin raw. They did not speak. There was no breath to spare for words. They simply moved one foot in front of the other, driven by the stubborn refusal to die in the snow. The sun climbed higher, but it gave no warmth. It was a cold, distant light that illuminated the world without heating it. Hayamovi stumbled, and Juliana caught him. "Keep walking," she said. "We are almost there." "How do you know?" he asked, his voice weak. "Because I will not let you die out here," she said fiercely. "You saved me. Now I save you." As they crested a low ridge, Prairie Rose came into view. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the main street was crowded with people. Even from a distance, Hayamovi could see the rope hanging from the gallows frame, swaying in the wind like a pendulum. "They are waiting for us," Juliana said. Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "I know," Hayamovi said. "Then why are we going back?" He looked at her. "Because running means dying slow. Fighting means dying on our feet." Juliana nodded. She did not argue. She simply tightened her grip on the ledger and kept walking. They entered Prairie Rose from the north, stumbling down the main street like ghosts. People stopped and stared. A child pointed. A woman gasped and crossed herself. And then the shouts began. "There he is. The Indian. Get the rope." Men poured out of the saloon, out of the livery, out of the general store. They formed a rough half-circle around Hayamovi and Juliana, closing off escape routes. Hayamovi positioned himself in front of Juliana, his body a shield. His hand went to his knife, but he did not draw it. Not yet. He was too weak to fight, but he would make them work for it. Duval and Barnaby pushed to the front, and their faces twisted with rage and fear. Barnaby's ostrich plume was singed, and Duval's coat was torn and blackened. "There he is," Barnaby shouted, pointing at Hayamovi. "Murderer, contract thief, he burned down the line shack and tried to kill us all." The crowd roared. Men surged forward, but Duval raised his hand, stopping them. He wanted control. He wanted the story to play out his way. Juliana straightened her voice, raw but loud enough to carry. "He freed me from a fake contract," she said. "Barnaby sold debts that never existed." Duval laughed, harsh and bitter. "Who is going to believe a dirty immigrant and a savage?" Before anyone could answer, Madeline and Dr. Simon forced their way through the crowd, flanked by Niels, Agnes, Pete, and Jacob. Madeline held up the letter, and the ledger edges singed from the fire, but still legible. The crowd parted for them, uncertain now. "I will," Madeline said. Her voice cut through the noise like a blade. She read the entries aloud, her voice steady and clear. She showed how the same hand had written both the supposed cousin's letter and the entries in Barnaby's ledger. She listed the names of women who had disappeared, women whose families had never heard from them again, and she placed the documents side by side for the crowd to see. A murmur ran through the gathering. Doubt began to creep in, softening the edges of the mob's fury. Men looked at each other, uncertain. Then Madeline flipped to the back of the ledger and read the entries written in the different hand. Lakota names with notes about trades and land deals. He was not just selling immigrant women, she said. He was selling Lakota women too, trading them for land deed revisions and army contracts. Hayamovi's head snapped up. "What?" Madeline looked at him, her eyes full of sorrow. "Winona," she said. "She is in here. Fort Laramie exchanged for supplies and a land deed revision 2 years ago." The world stopped. Hayamovi stared at her, at the ledger, at Barnaby. The trader's face had gone pale, and he took a step back. "You sold my sister." Hayamovi said. His voice was quiet, deadly. I did no such thing, Barnaby sputtered. That was army business, not mine. Your handwriting, Madeline said. Your ledger, your business. The crowd's mood shifted. Men who had been ready to lynch Hayamovi now turned their anger toward Barnaby. The betrayal was deeper than anyone had imagined. He had not just preyed on immigrants. He had betrayed the treaty's sold women from both sides and used the law to cover his tracks. Then Tobias Crane stepped forward. His face was pale, his hands trembling, but his voice was steady. Sheriff Duval killed his own brother, he said. It was not the Lakota. It was him. I helped him lie about it, and Barnaby has been using that lie to control him ever since. The murmur became a roar. Men turned to look at Duval, at Barnaby, at the rope hanging from the gallows. The neat story of savage killer and righteous lawman crumbled into dust. Duval, cornered and desperate, drew his revolver. The metal gleamed in the cold sunlight. To hell with all of you, he snarled. He aimed at Hayamovi. You die today, and the rest of this dies with you. Hayamovi did not move. He simply shifted so that Juliana was behind him, shielded by his body, and met Duval's gaze. You already killed one man to hide your fear, he said quietly. You want another. Duval's hand wavered. For a moment, it seemed as if he might lower the gun. His finger trembled on the trigger, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold. Then Cheyenne Charlie, seeing his world slipping away, snapped his rifle toward Juliana. She dies, none of this matters, he said. His voice was flat, emotionless. Hayamovi lunged, but his wounded body could not move fast enough. Juliana threw herself sideways, and the rifle cracked. The bullet tore through the air where she had been standing and struck the wooden post behind her. Tobias Crane, standing behind Duval, made a split-second decision. He had carried the weight of one lie for years, and it had nearly destroyed him. He would not carry another. He drew his sidearm and fired not at Hayamovi, but at the sheriff. The shot hit Duval in the shoulder, spinning him around. His revolver flew from his hand, landing in the snow. The crowd exploded into chaos. Niels tackled Charlie, driving him into the mud. Pete and Jacob wrestled the rifle away. Dr. Simon and two ranchers grabbed Duval before he could recover, forcing him to the ground. Others seized Barnaby as he tried to slip away, pinning him against the saloon wall. More shots rang out as deputies loyal to Duval tried to intervene, but they were outnumbered. The townspeople had turned their anger no longer directed at Hayamovi, but at the men who had betrayed them all. In the chaos, Hayamovi collapsed. The blood loss had finally caught up with him, and the world tilted sideways. Juliana caught him before he hit the ground, her arms around him, her voice in his ear. Stay with me, she said. You do not get to die now. Not after everything. Simon pushed through the crowd and knelt beside them. He saw the blood-soaked bandages, the pale color of Hayamovi's skin, and his face went grim. We need to get him to the clinic now, he said. The rope that had been meant for Hayamovi hung useless from the gallows beam, swaying in the cold wind. The town exploded into shouting and confusion. Men argued, women wept, children scattered. Duval and Barnaby were dragged through the mud and thrown into the same cells where Hayamovi and Juliana had shivered days before. The irony was not lost on anyone. Tobias Crane collapsed onto the boardwalk, his face in his hands, as the weight of years of guilt finally lifted. He had fired on his own sheriff, but he had stopped a murder. It was the first honest thing he had done in years. Dr. Simon and Madeline helped Hayamovi to the clinic, half carrying him through the streets. Juliana followed, still clutching the ledger, her bare feet leaving bloody prints in the snow. Inside the clinic, Simon worked quickly. He cleaned the wounds with carbolic acid, the smell sharp and medicinal. He stitched the gash in Hayamovi's side with careful practiced movements, each pull of the thread precise. The thigh wound was messier, but he packed it with clean linen and bound it tight. Hayamovi sat through it all without flinching his eyes on Juliana as she sat across the room, wrapped in a blanket, her hands shaking. When Simon was done, he turned to Juliana. "Let me see your feet," he said. She shook her head. "I am fine." "You are not fine," Simon said. "Let me see them." Reluctantly, she extended her legs. Simon examined her feet, his expression grim. Several toes were blackened at the tips, the skin hard and discolored. "You have frostbite," he said. "Not severe, but it will hurt for a while. You are lucky you did not lose any toes." He wrapped her feet in warm bandages soaked in salve and gave her a cup of hot broth. She drank it slowly, her hands still trembling. The warmth spread through her chest, and for the first time in days, she felt almost human. Outside, the town was coming to terms with what had happened. Madeleine and Niels copied the names from Barnaby's ledger, creating a record of every woman who had been sold through his fake contracts. Some of the names had notes beside them, destinations, dates. It was a map of suffering. But the entries at the back, the Lakota names, added a new dimension to the horror. Barnaby had not just preyed on immigrants. He had betrayed treaties, sold women from sovereign nations, and used his connections to cover it all up. That night, as the sun set over Prairie Rose, Hayamovi and Juliana sat together in the clinic's back room. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, Juliana broke the silence. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Hayamovi said, "we wait for the judge." And then Hayamovi looked at her. "Then you decide what you want." Juliana's eyes filled with tears. "I want to be free," she said. "Truly free." "You will be," Hayamovi said. "I promise." She reached out and took his hand. It was the first time she had touched him by choice, without fear or desperation. He did not pull away. They sat like that, hands clasped, as the light faded and the stars came out. The circuit court judge arrived 3 weeks later, riding into Prairie Rose under a clear sky. His name was Harlan Stone, and he was known as a hard man, but a fair one. 60 years old with white hair and a face like carved granite, he had spent 30 years riding circuit through the territories, dispensing justice with an even hand. He set up his court in the saloon, the only building large enough to hold the crowd. Tables were pushed-aside chairs arranged in rows, and a makeshift bench set up at the front. The smell of stale beer and tobacco lingered in the air, but no one seemed to mind. Tobias Crane testified first, his voice steady, as he detailed the lie about Duval's brother and the years of blackmail that followed. He held nothing back. When he was done, Judge Stone asked him, "Why did you wait so long to tell the truth?" Tobias looked down at his hands. "Because I was a coward," he said. "And I am sorry." "Courage is not the absence of fear," Stone said. "It is acting despite it. You acted when it mattered most." Madeleine Hart testified next, presenting the ledger and the forged letters. She showed how Barnaby had created fake debts and sold women like livestock. She read the names one by one, and with each name the crowd grew quieter, angrier. Then she read the Lakota entries, and the anger turned to something colder. Betrayal. Dr. Simon testified about the injuries he had treated, the whispered pleas for help, the women who had disappeared. His voice was flat, clinical, but the pain underneath was clear. Juliana testified last. She stood before the court in a borrowed dress, her feet still bandaged, and told her story in clear, unshaking words. She described the ship from Europe, the fake cousin, the contract she had signed with a thumbprint because she could not read English. She held up her scarred wrists and showed the court the rope burns. And she looked Barnaby in the eye as she said, "He sold me like an animal. And he did it to dozens of others. Women like me. Women like Winona. When she was done, Judge Stone sat in silence for a long moment. Then he spoke. "The contracts presented by Barnaby Lowell are fraudulent," he said. "All associated debts are void. Any woman currently bound by such a contract is hereby declared free." A cheer went up from the crowd. Juliana's knees buckled, and Hayamovi caught her before she fell. Judge Stone was not finished. "Sheriff René Duval is hereby stripped of his badge and will stand trial for conspiracy, attempted murder, and falsification of military records. Barnaby Lowell will face charges of fraud, human trafficking, conspiracy, and treaty violations. Cheyenne Charlie will face charges of attempted murder." He turned to Hayamovi. "You are free to go," he said, "and you have the court's thanks." Hayamovi nodded but did not smile. Freedom was a fragile thing, and he knew it. That night, a delegation of Lakota riders arrived in Prairie Rose, sent by Hayamovi's band to search for him. They had been worried by his long absence and feared the worst. When they saw him alive, they greeted him with relief and quiet joy. The leader of the delegation, an older man named Tatanka, listened as Hayamovi told the story of what had happened. When he was done, Tatanka studied Juliana for a long moment. "She fought beside you," Tatanka said. "Yes," Hayamovi said. "Then she is welcome at our fires," Tatanka said, "if she wishes." Juliana did not answer immediately. She looked at the Lakota riders at the town of Prairie Rose, at Hayamovi. Then she said, "I wish to be free, not to belong to anyone." "Then you will be free," Tatanka said. "No one will own you among our people." But Juliana was not ready to leave yet. She had unfinished business. She and Madeline worked together using Barnaby's ledger as a map to trace the women who had been sold through his contracts. Some were found in mining camps, others on remote ranches. Letters were sent, inquiries made. It was slow, painful work, but every name crossed off the list felt like a small victory. The Lakota entries were even more complicated. Winona's name led to Fort Laramie, and Hayamovi rode there with Tatanka and 2 other warriors. They found her working in a laundry, her hands raw from lye, her eyes still empty. But when she saw her brother, something flickered in her face. Recognition, and maybe a spark of hope. Hayamovi brought her home. It would be a long road back, but at least they were walking it together. As the snow began to melt and the first signs of spring appeared, Judge Stone returned with a proposal. Judge Stone sat across from Hayamovi and Juliana in the clinic's back room, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. The window was open, and the smell of wet earth and new grass drifted in on the breeze. It was late February, and the world was beginning to thaw. "I have a problem," he said. "The territory is too big, and I am too few. I need people I can trust to help me root out the men like Barnaby who prey on the weak." He looked at Juliana. "You speak German, Polish, and English. You know what it is like to be sold and lied to. I need an interpreter and a clerk, someone who can travel with the court and help question witnesses in remote settlements. You will be paid, and you will be free to leave whenever you choose." Then he looked at Hayamovi. "And I need a guide, someone who knows the land and is not afraid to stand up to hostile towns. The Lakota Council has agreed to let you serve in this role for 1 season in exchange for formal promises about hunting rights and fair treatment on the trail." Hayamovi and Juliana exchanged a glance. It was not a romantic look, not yet. It was something more practical, an assessment of risk, of opportunity, of the fragile trust that had grown between them. "What do you say?" Judge Stone asked. Juliana spoke first. "I will do it," she said. "But I will not be owned. Not by you, not by anyone." "You will be paid," Stone said. and you will be free to leave whenever you choose. Hiamovi nodded. I will guide you, he said, but my people come first. If they need me, I go. Fair enough, Stone said. He stood and offered his hand. Hiamovi shook it, then Juliana. And so the public story became simple and respectable, a circuit judge's party with a hired Lakota scout and an immigrant interpreter. Quietly, it gave Hiamovi and Juliana a way to stay near each other without lighting the fuse of social outrage that an open relationship would have caused. They would work together, travel together, fight together, and maybe in time, they would find something more. On the morning they departed, snow still clung to the shady corners of Prairie Rose, but the main street was mud and slush. The town had changed. Duval and Barnaby sat in the county jail awaiting trial. Tobias Crane had been appointed temporary sheriff, and he walked the streets with a sober sense of responsibility, determined to do better. Madeline Hart had taken over Barnaby's office, turning it into a center for immigrant aid and treaty advocacy. Dr. Simon Keller's clinic was busier than ever, treating people who had once been too afraid to seek help. Hiamovi mounted his pony carefully, his side still stiff. Juliana checked the satchel containing the ledger transcripts and fresh paper for the journey ahead. She wore sturdy boots, now a warm coat, and her hair was tied back in a practical braid. She looked stronger, tougher, like someone who had walked through fire and come out the other side. They shared a long look full of things they did not dare name aloud. Not love, not yet, but respect, trust, the knowledge that they had stood together when it mattered most. On the road, Juliana said, I will speak to the court. You speak to the land. Between us, maybe someone will listen. Hiamovi nodded. Between us, he replied, no one will sell another contract without a fight. As the judge's wagon rattled ahead and the Lakota riders flanked the column, Juliana stepped up onto the horse behind Hiamovi. She wrapped her arms around his waist for balance, and he did not pull away. The contact was chosen, not forced. It was a beginning. Together, under the thin spring sun, the Lakota warrior and the freed immigrant rode toward other towns, other rivers, other mines, carrying proof testimony and a quiet, undeniable loyalty that neither law nor prejudice could easily untangle. Prairie Rose shrank behind them, a small town with a long memory. But ahead lay miles of open country places where justice was still a word without meaning, where women were still sold and treaties still broken. Hiamovi and Juliana rode toward that horizon not as saviors, but as witnesses. They carried Barnaby's ledger and Tobias's confession. They carried the names of the disappeared and the scars of their own survival. And they carried each other, not with grand declarations or romantic promises, but with the simple, stubborn refusal to let go. As they crested a ridge and looked back one last time, they saw Madeline and Dr. Simon standing in the street watching them go. The schoolteacher raised her hand in farewell. The doctor nodded, a small smile on his weathered face. Then Hiamovi turned his pony toward the west, and Juliana tightened her arms around his waist, and they rode into the future together. Behind them, the sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the winter snow. The Powder River glittered in the distance, and somewhere a meadowlark sang. It was a new season, a new beginning. The rope that had hung from the gallows was gone now, cut down and burned. In its place hung a new sign painted by Madeleine's steady hand, Prairie Rose, where justice begins. And for the first time in a long time, the world felt just a little bit less cruel.